Welcome, everyone.
I actually haven't listened to more than the chorus in a long time, and I think like the lyrics are perhaps more fitting than I remembered. Except Prince has a cover where he says, instead of slob, he says slave, which is far more theologically rich. What if God was a slave like one of us? Which I thought Joan Osborne did too. But anyway, we are going to talk about the church and mission, and I prepared a brief presentation we just started, and I used a familiar PowerPoint framework because I didn't want to come up with a new PowerPoint. And Nicole and I talked a little bit about what we would title this, and I gave her some answers, and she gave me some answers. And what I didn't tell her is I already knew what the title was going to be, but I didn't want to tell her what it was because she wasn't going to like it. So the title of the presentation is, what is the Episcopal Church and its mission? And also, us.
What is us?
And you may be wondering why I would have asked Nicole to start with a song that came out before I was born. The first reason is to point out that it came out before I was born, and I think that's funny. The second reason is I was going to use it as this springboard into like a cute little anecdote about my high school youth group, and I was going to tell this story and then use this story to think about what it means for us to be a church, and I thought it was going to be great. And I'm not going to do that because I decided that that was a little cliche. So instead, I'm going to be a little more serious. I'm going to start with the catechism. If we want to think about what it is for us to be a church, we probably should turn to our own catechism, which is the back of our prayer book. I am going to mute you guys. Sorry, everyone. We should probably turn to the catechism at the back of our own prayer books, which is on page 854. And back there, we see this neat little section that asks, what is the church? And it presents us with all of the questions we want to ask and helpfully gives us all of the answers. So we see questions like, what is the church? And the catechism tells us the church is the community of the new covenant. And then it says, how is the church described in the Bible? And it tells us the church is described as the body of which Jesus Christ is the head and of which all baptized persons are members. It is called the people of God, the new Israel, a holy nation, a royal priesthood, and the pillar and ground of truth. Skipping down, you find this little section on the church's mission. The catechism asks, what is the mission of the church? And it tells us the mission of the church is to restore all people to unity with God and each other in Christ. Now, I think for many of us, these answers probably feel pretty familiar, comfortable, mundane even. Sure, the church is made up of baptized persons. Yes, the church finds its origins in the new covenant. Of course, the mission of the church is to restore all people to unity with God and each other. But I think it's worth thinking seriously about what these answers mean. Because in each of these answers is really just more questions. For instance, well, what does it mean to be the community of the new covenant? Are we the community of the new covenant? Are we living up to that call? I mean, yes, the church has had its saints. We have Bartolomé de las Casas, a Catholic priest who spoke out against the horrific Spanish encomienda system, which enslaved thousands of indigenous Americans. We have Absalom Jones, an Episcopal priest who fought for the equal status of Black Episcopalians and worked to end slavery. We have, more recently, Bishop William Gary of South Carolina, who was shot by a white supremacist for attempting to appoint a Black suffragan bishop. Surely these are all shining examples of the community of the new covenant. So maybe this answer is right. And yet each of their stories also shows the church's failure to live up to that standard. The white supremacist who shot Bishop Gary was an Episcopal priest. Absalom Jones's greatest opponents were other Christians. And Bartolomé's story is a masterclass in ambiguity. Yes, he fought bravely against the Spanish enslavement of indigenous people, but he advocated for replacing them with enslaved Africans, something he did not repent of until late in life. I thought really hard about whether to even include him. It seems especially wrong to place him next to Absalom Jones. But these are the names that come to mind when I think of saints. And I think that the discomfort I feel in seeing them side by side is exactly the point. People in the church have lived up to their calling, but people in the church have also seriously failed. We say that the church is a holy people, but what do we say about those among us who aren't living up to the call of holiness? Are they not the church? Conversely, what do we say about non-Christians? If we are a holy nation, a royal priesthood, the people of God, then what are they? Are they excluded from the gift of God in Jesus? Is that what we want to say? If we are the new Israel, well, what does that say about the first Israel? And these aren't insignificant questions. It matters how we talk about ourselves, because how we talk about ourselves changes how we relate to the world around us. It changes what we think our role is. And the church's language about itself has been used to justify racism, classism, anti-Semitism, colonialism. This is a map of the British Empire at its height. And it's here because we are a church of the Anglican Communion, a communion birthed of the colonial expansion of that empire. For much of our history, Anglican missionaries traveled alongside colonists. Many of them traveled to minister exclusively to those colonists. For them, the church had become synonymous with the British Empire. And if that was the case, then what does that make the world? Well, it makes the world that the church is missioning to all of the places the empire is colonizing. And it changes the meaning of mission. For many Anglican missionaries, the idea of spreading the gospel was almost indistinguishable from spreading British culture. For the Church of England, the answer to the question, what is the church, was hard to distinguish from the answer to the question, what is the British state? And this is part of our story. The famed first American bishop, Samuel Seabury, was a loyalist. He strongly defended the British Empire. There's a whole song in Hamilton about how he was a bad guy in the Revolution. You should listen to it. It's not 100% accurate, but it's fun. And we, the Episcopal Church, we struggle with this too. We have learned our answers well from our mother church. Think back to this past summer when Donald Trump had a group of protesters removed from in front of St. John's, D.C., because he wanted to take a picture with the Bible. The rector there and the Bishop of D.C. spoke out against it. They said the church does not belong to the president. The church is not a backdrop for the state-sponsored photo ops. And they're right. But if you go to St. John's website, you'll see that they call themselves the parish of the presidents. They pride themselves in their connection to the state's rituals. The Episcopal Church is closely tied to the ritual of the state. Our presidents pray in Episcopal churches before their inaugurations. Our military gets its Bibles blessed in the halls of the Episcopal National Cathedral. The Episcopal Church is very close to the political heart of the country. This is something we've learned from the Anglican Communion. If we're not careful about how we talk about ourselves, we may find the phrase holy nation being used to describe not the church, but the U.S. And our mission becomes not spreading the gospel, but spreading Americanism. Is this what we want? Is this what we think the church is? Now, I want to pause and say it's easy to identify problems with the church's language. It's easy to criticize these answers that we have. It's easy to see how catechetical answers get misused, misinterpreted. But these are the answers that technically define us. This is the language about community and mission that we have inherited from our tradition. And it does make us, in some part, distinct. And it informs the way we relate to the world around us. And so can we interrogate these answers about ourselves? Aren't these answers precisely what holds us together, what makes us us? What would it mean to be a church apart from them, a church without answers? Well, I asked Nicole to start with the song, What If God Was One of Us? For a couple of reasons. First, it is 5 months older than me, and I think that is very funny. Second, it reminds me of my high school youth group. When I was in 10th grade, my youth pastor, Mitch, asked my class what we thought a Christian was. One person told him a Christian is a person who believes in the Bible. Another said it was a person who goes to church. I said it was a person who worships Jesus. After each answer, Mitch shook his head. These answers were close, he said, but not quite right. Finally, he played this song, which we all listened to. It was strange to hear the question, "What if God was one of us?" sung over and over in a church. But when it finished, Mitch said, "A Christian is a person who knows the answer to that question." And I've thought about this a lot over the years. It became my center as I started to leave the Baptist church and wander from church to church. Because as I moved, all the other definitions of Christian that I thought I knew started to fall away. Not all Christians, I learned, worshiped like Baptists. Not all Christians regularly attended what I call church. Not all Christians took the Bible literally. Some, many even, didn't take it seriously either. Still, I thought the one thing we have in common is the answer to that question. We know what it means for God to be one of us. That's what holds us together. And this is not true. Christians do not agree on the answer to Joan Osborne's question. Sure, we often use similar language to answer the question, but if you press on what that language means, you'll find that it varies from church to church, and even from person to person. And I don't think this is a controversial opinion. It is, in fact, a point of pride amongst Episcopalians and other mainline Protestants that we do not have the answers. While others really like this about the Episcopal Church, I personally find it a little disconcerting. I grew up believing that a Christian is a person who knows the answers. Perhaps not all the answers, but at least the most important one. Frankly, the fact that that is not the case leaves me a little disoriented. If we don't have the answers, then what holds us together? The other day, as I was picking up some food, this song, Joan Osborne's song, started playing overhead. So immediately, I texted Mitch. I told him about the song. I joked about how effective the lesson was 10 years ago. We hadn't spoken in about a year, but soon we were texting back and forth. We talked about the pandemic and school, but more importantly, we talked about ministry, about mission and the church. And Mitch and I don't agree about a lot of things. I am, after all, working at an Episcopal church and studying at a liberal Methodist seminary. He, on the other hand, works at a relatively conservative Southern Baptist church. And these differences are only exacerbated by the fact that I am here in Decatur and he is in a much more rural setting. I'm sure if we talked about it, we would disagree about many, if not most, social issues. Our staunchest disagreement, however, would probably remain the Eucharist, which Mitch, like all Baptists, is hopelessly wrong about. Despite our differences, though, we can talk to each other. We can gather and reflect on what it is to be a church because we're still both driven by the same question: what if God was one of us? If our answers don't hold us together, then perhaps our questions can. Rather than saying that a Christian is a person who knows the answer to Joan Osborne's question, perhaps it's better to say that a Christian is a person who asks it. Maybe that is the solution to our own dilemma. Maybe it's okay not to have an answer to the question, what is the Episcopal Church? Maybe it's enough simply to ask. And obviously that is not true, as Joan Osborne herself would tell you. According to this definition, Joan Osborne would be a Christian, because a Christian is a person who asks the question, what if God was one of us? And Joan Osborne certainly asks that question many, many times. But if you asked Joan Osborne if she was a Christian, she would say no. According to one 2008 interview on BeliefNet.com, Joan Osborne considers herself influenced by Christianity and by Buddhism, but she does not claim to belong to either. It is not enough, then, to say that the question makes the Christian. And so in our case, I can ask, what is the Episcopal Church, and not thereby become an Episcopalian. Asking the question is central, but it's not sufficient. We need, likewise, to be compelled to answer it. For Joan Osborne, the question, what if God was one of us, is rhetorical. She does not feel compelled to seek an answer. For the Christian, however, the question, what if God was one of us, is existential. It drives us towards an answer. It's the question that draws us together and brings us again and again to the Word and the altar. And this is not to say that we need to answer the question correctly. I'm not even saying that we need to think we've answered correctly. A Christian is simply a person who hears the question and is driven to try. That is the drive of grace. A Christian is a person who is so compelled by the question of Jesus that they will follow him however far he leads. A person so compelled by the question of Jesus that it drives them to seek out others who are asking. A Christian is a person who tries to answer the question of Jesus, knowing that they will fail, but trusting nevertheless in the God who gives them the grace to speak. And that, I think, is the answer to our dilemma. We do not need to know definitively what the Episcopal Church is, or even what the Church is. We do not need to hold dogmatically to the answers that have been given us in the past. We can interrogate what the Church has said about itself. We can interrogate how the Church has lived. What we need to do, if we want to be a church, is to ask those questions and try to offer answers, knowing that those answers may be wrong, will be wrong, and that we will not necessarily agree. We will need to interrogate and even change our answers, but we must return again and again to the questions, what is the church? What is our mission? And perhaps most importantly, what if God was one of us? And none of this is rhetorical. This is exactly what we're doing today. These are our questions. What is the church? Why are we here? What is our mission? So we're going to move into breakout rooms. I know that was a lot to throw at you. So I'm going to tell you maybe how I would start if I was in your breakout room is I would grab a prayer book and I would flip to page 854 and I would look at these questions. What is the church? And I would look at the answers and discuss with the people in the prayer book, or the prayer book. You can't do that. Discuss with the people in your breakout room.
There are people who made these answers, though, so in some ways that's not wrong.
Yes, that's true. Do you agree with these answers? Do you like them? Do you not like them? What would you say instead? And then we're going to come back and talk about that as a large group. Sound good? Okay. Recreate breakout rooms. And Nicole, do we have a time that we use? How long?
Yep, we're gonna do 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Don't have to change anything. All right. Goodbye. I'll see y'all in 10 minutes.
It's practically the same group as we were in for coffee hour.
With the exception of Jeff.
We added April and Jeff.
Yeah,
Good morning.
Well, I've got my prayer book here.
I got mine too.
I'm letting John look at mine.
I don't.
Yeah.
Well, I've thought a lot about a conversation that I had many years ago with Elsie Gore, who some of you knew and some of you did not.
Mm-hmm.
Elsie Gore was full of certainty, and I was full of doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And the conversation didn't go very well.
Yeah.
And I like Matt saying we didn't have to have the answers.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of answers I don't have.
All of this reminds me of, I participate, I sort of fall in and out of this group called Episcopalians on Facebook, which is sort of there's like 35,000 members, and there are some young, recently educated seminarians, people who are in discernment, and they're all young, and there's a group of them, and they are very orthodox. And they think that the problems with today's church is that people do not go through enough catechesis, if I'm correct. In other words, our problem is that, we need to be more doctrinal. And I kind of have problems with that. But at the same time, I think the catechism is there for us to wrestle with in the same way that the Nicene Creed is there for us to wrestle with. And I don't necessarily think that it should be monkeyed around with, you know. So that's kind of the way I hold a lot of this stuff. I don't know if that makes any sense or
I
not.
think maybe I have a foot in both of those camps. I
Yeah.
think if we don't have some sort of doctrinal basis, we have nothing with which to relate to each other.
Right. I mean, we are who
But
we
if
are.
we're stuck entirely on that, then we don't relate beyond each other.
Right. I think it's kind of a sickness, if you will, of our current age in this country anyway, that we feel like we can't commit to anything, that we can't commit to a church or a belief system. And part of that, I think, arises out of the failures of the church. You know, the whole experience of the unchurched and the spiritual but not religious, you know.
It's part of consumer culture too, that
right.
you can find what you like, and then if you don't like it, you can always choose something else.
Right. I think some of it is rooted in rationalism, which is that we can control and make ourselves happy, you know, and it's all about, you know, I don't need God. But I think there's a lot of people who are just reluctant to this whole issue about what is the mission of the church. The aspect of that I find most challenging is that different Christians see the mission of the church entirely differently. There's some Christians that see the mission of the church as one of individual salvation and belief, and it pretty much ends there. And then there are other Christians who believe that being a Christian is about the healing of the world, which is a whole thing in Judaism. I forget, there's a name for it. I forget what the name is.
Yeah, I know what you
I'll
mean.
let some other people talk, as we're about halfway through our time. But that's the most challenging and kind of disturbing aspects of mission, for me anyway. That there are Christians that believe it's all about extracting a confession of faith and individual salvation, whereas for other people it is a much more communal healing of the world and the creation. Kind of getting away from the catechism. And I'm talking too much.
What do you think, Jeff?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what I think. I think that I have a different view than everybody else has. I look at the church as a place to collectivize and find out ideas that are going to help us work within the world and reach out and be able to take in the world and make it part of the church and to find the structure in Jesus by looking back at the cross and seeing where we can be saved and we can help and move other. That's very disjointed, but that's kind of the way I'm looking at it this minute.
That seems like right in line with the text here, though. The church pursues its mission as it prays and worships, proclaims the gospel, and promotes justice, peace, and love. I heard a lot of that in what you were saying. And restore people to unity with God and each other in Christ.
I think what the church faces now is just in the world that we live in, everybody wants to be on the number one church or the number one idea, and we want to criticize everything else.
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, that's not new though. I mean,
no, it's not new, but it's where we are.
Yeah, it is where we are. Yeah.
Well, it's where we always have been, I think. I don't think we can seem to get ourselves past
I mean,
that.
people used to kill each other over transubstantiation, right?
Right, and that's the one thing that's
Well,
unique about Anglicanism is that Anglicans decided that we don't have to agree on matters of doctrine outside the basics of there was a saying that was attributed to Martin Luther incorrectly, I think, though, that in essentials unity, in everything else, diversity or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Some years ago, Claiborne, I think in a sermon, preached about why we say we believe in the Nicene Creed. And it's sort of as my rendition of her preaching, which she might deny utterly. I will say that right up front, is that we are holding each other together in belief. At any given moment, I may not believe every word of that. You may not believe every word of that, but we're, as a community, we're holding this belief.
Yeah.
And I sort of like that we're kind of scooping each other up.
Yeah.
It's in the Apostles' Creed, it's I believe, and I have wanted to ask somebody who more theologically educated than I, what they see as the difference in those two. But I like that Claiborne's thing about
The collective we
believe.
Yeah.
We have gathered together as a group to promote this. I also have come back over and over again in this whole series about calling to what calling is. And that's what a mission is, of course. And I think that what I've come to is our calling is the new commandment. Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Whatever individual points of dogma we believe or don't believe.
Yeah. There's a distinction a Jewish friend of mine said between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So orthodoxy is believing the right thing, and orthopraxy is just doing the right thing. So sometimes we're held together by the things that we do together more than necessarily what we actually believe.
Well, it probably works both ways with that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're held together by what we believe, and sometimes by what we do.
Yeah.
But we're probably judged more by what we do.
For sure. Well, I guess we're heading back to the main room.
Yeah, I think we're about to be cut off, folks. Good seeing everybody.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Paul.
Interesting.
And Jeff.
I am.
It was an accident. But
It's God. It's
one,
God.
I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, welcome back, everyone, from your group. If you were like me, I texted Matt about 3 minutes before it was going to end and said, "You can't add more time, can you?" Because I felt like we just started getting at some of the deep questions I think that are swirling around for many of us. But I do hope that we can continue this conversation together as a whole group. And so I am just going to ask a few of you to share what came up for you in your small group. And if you could tell us, just briefly, what had the most energy in your small group. I'd like to get just a few things on the table for us. You can unmute yourself and talk at any point.
Well, our small group was so lucky because we had Amy in our small But anyway, we talked about the new covenant and, how that was, well, what does that mean? And so we looked at the answer to that question. and which was on page 850. I've got my Book of Common Prayer here, and it talked about the key word in that was relationship. That our relationship with God is different as a result of this new covenant. And then we talked about what the mission of the church was as well, which was restoring people to the unity with God.
Yeah, you've done the
Word restore implying that at some point we had been in unity with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that something happened to even disrupt that community, and still is happening perhaps to disrupt that community. So that gets at sort of the meta narrative, I think, of the story that we tell ourselves about who we are and what is the church in the world and our purpose and our value behind that. What else came up in other groups?
I think in our group, one of the things that came up towards the end was the song again. What if God was one of us? And it got to the point of what if he came to our churches and he was, well, first we said Black, and what would that do to churches? And secondly, most definitely, if he came back as he was, he would be of color. He would look Muslim. He would look Arabic. And what would that do of our perceptions? And for me personally, I said, I think we're meant to be troubled and to be challenged, much as Catherine did today for us. And as the others do when they preach, to be troubled, to be challenged, and not to feel this is the way it is.
We didn't have Amy in our group, but we had Pat Graves. And she reminded us of the really what felt like the heart of the new covenant, which is to love God with all your heart and mind and love your neighbors as yourselves. So we kind of felt like that was really the meat and the meaning, but that we end up putting a lot of structures on that. The church puts a lot of definitions and guardrails around what that means, but that those things end up dividing us because we define, okay, that's what that means to us, and therefore we are the right ones. And if when it means something else to another part of the church, it ends up dividing us.
That's sort of where our group ended up to. One of the last things that was said was that the church is about learning how to love God and love your neighbor. And another person shared that it was about learning how to be in the world. There was some discomfort around certainty, I think, expressed in our group. And one of the things that I expressed was that the mission of the church broadly seems to be kind of bifurcated. There's part of the church that believes that being a Christian is primarily a task of individual salvation. In other words, going out and getting people to assent to certain beliefs, and as a result of that belief, being saved. And there's other part of the church, and I would kind of put the Episcopal Church more in this second framework, that it's about the healing of the world, the healing of creation, and the healing of our relationships with each other. It's a very tricky thing. I'm kind of a universalist, so I tend to think that, whatever happened on the cross wasn't on Jesus's or God's agenda to create a membership club. that we are really about proclaiming this great thing that happened in time that was the work of God.
I was in Catherine's group, and we talked more than anything else about the challenge of finding Christ in all others. That the Catherine was saying, well, if you truly, understand Christ's love, then perhaps that can happen to you. But finding Christ in everyone is a huge, I don't know, an area of wonder. How can we do that? Yeah.
Any other tensions or thoughts to put on the table? One of the things that my group talked about, and I hear this a little bit in Paul's sharing and a little bit from Anne sharing, is what is this question about what we do with Jesus? And I just want to name that sort of outright, because I do think sometimes it is a hard question for us, particularly at Epiphany. And so I'm wondering what, if not Jesus, because sometimes I feel like folks maybe don't want to say that that's what connects and distinguishes us as a community, then what is? Or if it is Jesus, then how and what does that mean? And I'm wondering if we might wrestle with that just a little bit together today.
I think one of the interesting aspects of your question, Nicole, is when we talk about Jesus, what are we seeing in our minds? In my mind, we talked a little bit in our group about this, to the sense that, if you're seeing a blue-eyed, fair-skinned Jesus, who is the picture on the wall when you were a child, then when we say that we share Jesus, are we paying attention to what the other person's image or belief of what Jesus looks like? Because we are basically tactile, physical people, and those images mean a lot. And it's an interesting question, because that raised the question that came up later with us, and that is, what if Jesus or God isn't it all? I mean, what especially Jesus, because we are talking about incarnate with him. That if Jesus is a sun wizened Arabic looking person or Bedouin looking person, that's a whole lot different than that image of Jesus on the wall that follows you around the room with his eyes. It's just a whole different, which in and of itself says a lot about the idea about Jesus watching you wherever you are. But we have all this luggage that we carry, and I don't mean that necessarily badly, that we carry around with us that defines it in our discussions.
And David, could you say just a little bit more about why the identity of Jesus would matter so much?
Because I think we are a modern world that sees things. We watch TV. We don't read as much as we used to. We are into visual cues, and those visual cues certainly affect our beliefs. It's just a fact, and at least I think it is a fact. It may not be a fact to everyone, but I see it as a fact, and so it makes an interesting twist on things. I'm not trying to judge it, though. Please don't. I hope no one thinks I'm doing that. I'm just trying to describe where we are and how we differ, and how that makes discussion difficult sometimes.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that points us exactly back to Luther Smith's question to us last week about how we imagine or image Jesus matters a lot for faith, but also for what it means to gather and be sent out. and it changes the whole sociality in some ways of what we understand ourselves to be doing and remembering. And so I don't either want to say that I'm making any judgments, but I do want us to grapple a little bit with what he was inviting us to do, and Catherine again today.
Yes.
I wonder what it would have been like had, from the very beginning, the church sort of required, let's just use our imagination, that churches in areas that are predominantly white image that all of our iconography is of dark-skinned Jesus, and of areas of the world where people are dark skinned, they would be required to have a light-skinned Jesus. It's just kind of an interesting mind sort of thing to play around with. But also, I mean, we all do need to see a reflection of ourselves in the image of Jesus. So at the same time that Jesus came to certainly to tear down these boundaries, all these boundaries that we have, they're all artificial, so interesting though. I thought David's comments were really interesting. I mean, Jesus did come into the world at a specific, the scandal of particularity is that Jesus was dark skinned and came into a part of the world where people were dark skinned. So does that literalism mean that all iconography needs to portray Jesus as dark skinned?
Yes.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that's one answer. That's one answer.
Because, you can't require people with dark skin to really, that's the only image of Jesus is the white one. That's the problem, because the white is the power.
Yeah.
And Jesus came with powerless.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Culturally, absolutely culturally.
But historically, Jesus came to brown-skinned people as a brown-skinned person. He didn't come to them as a white-skinned person or a black-skinned person. He came to them as a person like them.
Yes.
And it's making that connection, that from the specific to the general, from the specific to the universal, that's what the church is supposed to help us do, I think. But may not. But it would have been funny if he came to, had appeared in Bethlehem and around about in Galilee. He's been running around as a blue-eyed blonde. I mean, who would have taken him seriously? No. He was one of them.
Yeah.
Son of David and all that.
Look how his gender, the particularity of his gender, was used to universally through the church, and a struggle for the last 2,000 years, how it's affected the way women participate in the church.
Yeah, it still is.
Yeah, as someone is about 12 years old, I asked my mother, where is the daughter of God? Where is she? And what does she do? And so I think that my answer, what do we do about Jesus? Oftentimes I want to use words like love and light, and that Jesus is one of the best examples of those. But I sort of want to take, but certainly when I think about finding the face of Christ in every person, I'm definitely thinking of a personification. But when I think about Jesus, especially as the Christ, I want it to be less personification and more about attributes.
I keep remembering that we are made in the image of God, and that it's not white people are made in the image of God, or people of color are made in the image of God. We are all made in the image of God. And for me, Jesus tells me what God is like by his life. He tells me about the love of God in a very definite way. And it doesn't have anything to do with the color of his skin or what he looked like. Well, yeah, it does. And what he looked like. I mean, I want to know what he looked like. I want a biography. But 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 it tells me about God, about how about God, period.
I keep thinking about what Catherine was saying this morning and about the cross being a lynching tree. And I think about what, if instead of a crucifix, if we were Catholic, if our image was a black man hanging from a tree in the front of our church, how would that be? And I guess that's probably how it was for, that's why the crucifix is a shock. The crucifix is not a shocking symbol to us because we're so used to it, but that is a shocking symbol. So I'm just kind of turning over in my mind what that would do for us if that's what we were displaying.
But the Jesus that we know is the one that rose.
Yeah.
He was on the cross, but he's not there anymore.
Right. Yeah. No, I know, and that's but still, it's it's an image that is profound.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with that. I sometimes in Good Friday services, I'm thinking that if Jesus or if God is listening to this, he's saying, "What about all these people that are being crucified there in your world, where you're sitting in this room worrying about, sort of almost glamorizing this event." That's the wrong term to use, but that God on Good Friday is saying, "Look at all these people you're crucifying," and here you are, bemoaning. Feel sorry about all of those Jesuses where there's divine presence in those human lives that are marginalized in our current time.
Something I hear you guys saying in all of this is this tension between our need to see ourselves reflected in our images and also the need for our images to scandalize us. And it makes me think of, I don't know if y'all have ever been to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, the Basilica in DC. If you go downstairs, there is this sort of ring of different altars, each dedicated to different images of Mary. And at each altar, the image of Mary reflects a particular nationality who is devoted to that image. And so it speaks to that need we have to see ourselves, to see the daughter of God reflected in our images, to see the Son, to see God as, Black or Latina or, white or Asian.
Nativities, yeah.
You see that in our nativities as well.
Right. And yet the thing about the Basilica of the National, the ridiculous name, the thing about that church is that all of those shrines are downstairs and upstairs is just this big white Jesus. And so what that makes me think about is related to, I think, this question about crucified Jesus, resurrected Jesus. Which one do we hold on to? And I think we have to be more like the downstairs church. We need both images, because both do different things. And we have to interrogate ourselves when we find our language and our imagery looking more like the upstairs church.
Yeah. Can I say something?
I think that in Latin America, I remember visiting churches and being struck at how much more sort of tortured, Christ on the cross was. He didn't look, while he was still white, he looked like he'd had a much harder time than in American Catholic churches. And it's sort of like, well, for the people there to look like you have suffered, you have to look a whole lot worse than Americans who have suffered. And that's sort of what this conversation reminds me of, like, well, yes, he's white, but he's had a pretty terrible time of it.
There are a lot of aesthetic barriers up as well. When I walked in the room when this presentation started, that song was on. I'd never heard that song before because that's not my kind of music. And I listened. I said, "What is this? Why are these people using this song like it's the anthem of something or the other?" I'd never heard it, and I understand the lyrics at a certain level, but it didn't speak to me. And I think we do that not only in visual images, but in other presentations. I watched one of the George Floyd funerals this summer, or whenever that was. It's just in no time, whenever that happened. And the funeral was going on, and I heard speeches, and I said, I was saying to myself, amen, amen. And they went on, and then a woman came on to sing, and she started out in the first couple of minutes of the song seemed fine, and then she started making love to the microphone. And I kept thinking, this is not appropriate. This is not the kind of music you ought to be singing at this funeral. And I never felt so white in my life. It was just
Excellent.
incredible, because I said, this is wrong. It's just flat wrong. And our church is the church of good taste, and we don't have music like that in our church. And if this guy is a martyr, he needs a better composer.
Well, Catherine and I are
those
gonna
kind
have
of
to
barriers go up all the time. Not only the visual ones, but auditory ones and language barriers as well.
Catherine and I are going to have to get ready for the second service here in a little bit. But before we go, I really do want to just kind of sum up a few things I've heard. I think one of the things that we're wrestling over, and I'm so glad we're wrestling over it, is this particular Jesus. Jesus had particular identity markers. Jesus was particularly killed in a certain way. And what does that mean and say about our faith? But I also see us struggling with, and I just want to name this outright, is that particularity is meant to move us to the God who is, as Paul said, is universal, right? And so how is it that our imaginations, the way that we perceive and understand the world, is translating the love of God in and through that particular image of whoever it is in front of us? And that message is going to change based on the power dynamics, I think, that are involved in the encounter, per Matt's point about the upstairs and downstairs church. And so when we're aware and seeing and sort of understanding that that God's work in Jesus is happening all around us all at the time, I think we're asking the question, how do we gather around that memory? How do we gather around that church? And what is our response as witnesses to God's work in Jesus in the world? I'm really excited. Next week, we're going to be talking. Today, we sort of talked in the big picture, about what is the church, what connects and distinguishes us at church. And next week, we're going to talk in the particular. So there's going to be a panel of folks with us who are going to share some of the stories that of how Epiphany has understood who they are and how they've responded to the call of God throughout our history. And we'll do some more wrestling together about what connects and distinguishes us as church here in this world. Thank you so much again for being with us. I don't think that we have had any good answers that we can submit to the BCP prayer book that is revising us. But if you all want to keep working on it, I'd be happy to make an amendment to some of that literature as they go forward. Any last thoughts, questions to throw out there before we get going here?
If I could.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, please.
If I could just throw a thought out there, I think sometimes we need to remember that even the disciples didn't recognize Christ after the resurrection. So it's hard sometimes.
It's super hard.
Nor did they know who he was before.
Nope.
One of the thoughts that comes to my mind is that although the catechism may not have answers that we can throw ourselves into necessarily every time, it does seem to be doing, what I think the intention is of it to do in this conversation, for example. And altering it, tweaking it here and there really is just going to create another set of minor kind of, problems for us. And so I'm not one of those who generally thinks the catechism needs to be revised or the Nicene Creed needs to be revised, because they're doing what they're supposed to do if they're being wrestled with, Kind of my 2 cents, I guess.
In the very first class of this series, Evan said that he thought the church was dying. And I have turned that over and over in my mind every day since then. And I think that we're proof that it's not quite that, we're not quite that far. I think the fact that we're talking about it and that we're showing up is hopeful.
One of the things about being a Christian church is that language of dying is always tied to language of resurrection. So I think it's okay to have those conversations and to think about what that might mean, knowing and trusting in the reality of the resurrection nonetheless. I think Nicole had to go with Catherine to set up. So I'm not usually here. Paul, do you know how we proceed?
Do we?
You're muted. You're still muted.
Oh, thank you. I'm talking way up to myself. Yeah, we sort of begin to wrap it up about now. We're kind of bumping up on time. But, if people want to stick around and discuss this a bit more, that's fine too. Anybody who would like to share some more thoughts?
Well, I want to, because Dan said something a minute ago, and you're talking about the early church, basically, it occurs to me that we talk about 12 disciples, and those numbers were selected by an early church or modified, I think there were at least 13, because I think Mary Magdalene deserves to be she deserves a shout out. I think she was there. She was actually waiting on Christ along, with the other Mary and and the disciples. And so even back then, the church, or at least the early church, when it started writing down the stories and canonizing them, defined things in a, really? She was apostle to the apostles. That sounds like a secondary down in the basement altar to me, but that's, but anyway, that was my point. And I thought when Dan made his statement, that just bubbled to the top of my mind, that as early as the beginnings of the church, that we were restricting, defining, and it wasn't just race, it wasn't just color, skin, it was sex, it was, there were a lot of other things, but yeah.
Any other thoughts?
So
Great discussion.
I have a request for Matt. At some point during your talk with us, you started, you were answering the questions really fast.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could send those out to us somehow in writing.
I can send y'all the PowerPoint
Okay.
if you like. And I can also send you the only the people here. No one else is allowed to see the very rough draft of what I said, but y'all are welcome to it if you would like it.
Thank you. Yes.
Always thought-provoking, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. It's been fun.
All
I
right,
realized I
guess
didn't
we'll-
change my name, so I'm sure should Epiphany read her Old Testament.
Well done. Any final burning desires?
Good to be with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, good discussion. Thank you, everyone. And I guess we'll be together virtually soon. Take care of yourselves.
Bye, everyone.
Bye now.